If there are no other announcements, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Alison Smart. She's the Executive Director of Probable Futures. Probable Futures is a nonprofit climate literacy initiative out of New Bedford. And their main goal is basically to make climate science accessible to everyone so that they can use this information in their everyday decisions. Something that stood out to me when I was reading through your mission is that they don't only make data accessible, but they also explicitly said they make them beautiful. And probably this is influenced by our speaker's background in the arts. She actually went to college to study theater. And after that, she has held different roles, including Vice President for Strategy and Advancement at Woodwell Climate Research Center, where she is also currently a Senior Fellow for Communications. She was also the Vice President for Development and Marketing at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. She was also the Vice Chair of the Citerian Theater and is an active member of the BMW Foundation's Responsible Leaders Network. In 2023, Alison was also recognized as one of the GRIST 50 Fixers, which is how I found about her work. And today she's here to share some of that work with us. So please help me welcome Alison to TAPS.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad to be here. I am Alison Smart, Executive Director of Probable Futures. As the professor said, we are a climate literacy initiative. So I speak with audiences very often, C-suites, boards of organizations, classes like you, elected officials across completely different industries, sectors, from humanitarian to high finance to the big consulting companies to agriculture. And we do this because we believe that climate literacy is an essential 21st century skill. In fact, in the same way that digital literacy or financial literacy is really essential for living in the modern world and thriving in the modern economy, well, now climate literacy is too. And you may ask yourself, well, why shouldn't we have always needed climate literacy? Why do we all of a sudden need it now? And to answer that question, we need to go back to the beginning of civilization. 12,000 years ago, when something kind of magical happened. Different communities on different continents around the world, all around the same time, for the first time, started to settle, started to stay in one place, practice agriculture, and eventually build up cities and towns. And for a long time, scientists and archaeologists didn't know why this was the case. And actually, climate science helped them understand why. So what we're looking at here is a graph of the global temperature history of the Earth. And this graph starts at the dawn of civilization, 12,000 years ago, or in about 9,500 BCE. So what's happening on this graph is that the global average temperature for each of these 12,000 years is being measured, and then it's being compared against the late 19th century. So the way to understand this graph is two things. Number one, the straighter the line is, the more stable the global average temperature, and by extension, the more stable the climate was. And number two, the closer the data point is to zero, the more similar that climate was to the climate of the late 19th century. So take a look at that. Over the course of 12,000 years, that global average temperature barely even fluctuated a degree. And the beginning and end of the graph, it stays at zero. So it was a stable global average temperature and a stable climate. And that stable climate is what allowed us to stay in one place and to build long-term communities. And those communities over time had their own cultures. And those cultures formalized into governments, which built infrastructure, anything from roads and bridges to laws and policies that figuratively and literally paved the way for the economy until we had all kinds of specializations in this very complex, globalized, very technological, and very sophisticated civilization that we are living in today. But humans have been around for much longer than we've had civilization. In fact, our earliest ancestors emerged in Africa around 200,000 years ago. But for the first 190,000 years of our existence, we did not have civilization. We were a hunting and gathering species. We did not stay in one place. And looking at this graph, now that we've extended it back, helps us understand why. So this is the same graph here, but you can see that the global average temperature over those 190,000 years changed dramatically up and down over the course of time. And so what that meant was that humans had to go around to different places, find the nice climate to live in, find the good temperatures, the hospitable temperatures, find the good plants and animals to sustain them. And that just wasn't conducive to settling into one place. But here, climate stability, that was what we needed to settle. And the climate of civilization wasn't just stable, it actually also happened to be perfect for humans. There were large amounts of temperate land where we could spread out and settle. There were stable seasonal patterns. So even if you lived in a place where there were extremes, like even a place like here, where the summer and the winter are very different, or for example, a place where there's a monsoon, that monsoon would come at the same time, year after year after year. And so you could build a society around those patterns. And very importantly, nowhere on Earth was it too hot for the human body. Humans could live everywhere. And the Earth could, in fact, be too hot for humans. It actually was back 40, 50, 60 million years ago. It was great for large reptiles like dinosaurs, not so great for humans. But I'll direct your attention toward the right-hand side of the graph here, where we now see that the climate is changing. The atmosphere is warming. We have broken out of that civilization temperature band. And if we continue on the same trajectory, we'll be breaking out of that band of global average temperatures that humans have ever lived with. But what this all helps us understand is that climate change isn't just about warmer temperatures. It's about instability. And it's about the fact that we've never maintained civilization in a changing climate before. That's brand new. It's a paradigm shift, and we're going to need new skills and tools, literacy, knowledge, sensibilities, values, maybe even, to live well and to thrive in that new paradigm. And we're going to need all of those things, and we're going to need this climate literacy, because everything that we have built in our civilization, in our society, assumes that climate stability will continue. In fact, specifically, everything that we have built assumes that the climate of that place will stay exactly the same. And we see that in things like storm sewers are designed for certain amounts of precipitation. So the storm sewers here in Boston are designed for the storms that Boston typically gets. That's going to be different than the storm sewers in London, and that's going to be different than the storm sewers in Shanghai. Our power systems are meant to withstand certain maximum temperatures. So we could build a power plant and we could say, okay, well, it really never gets above X temperatures here, so we only need this much power supply. Even our cultural practices, so our festivals, events, activities, even our school schedules, sports occur at specific times of year and in specific places where there's good climate for those kinds of things. And all agriculture everywhere in the world, no matter where it is dependent on steady precipitation. Whether it's irrigated or not, that precipitation is coming from snow or from rain or from lakes that are fed by rain. And so at this point, we need to do two things. We need to, number one, make sure that we make everything that we built on top of that stable climate as resilient as possible and as able to withstand as much climate instability. But we also need to make sure that we don't go so far up that climate instability ramp that things start to fall apart. We don't actually know how much civilization we can maintain in an unstable climate. So we need to make sure that we are protecting what we have now and then avoiding the most extreme outcomes. And this is a little bit different than the message that I think that we historically have heard from the climate community, from public discourse, from the media. And that was one of the reasons that we created Probable Futures, because we often heard climate change and the future within climate change being portrayed in this very binary way, or one of these binaries, which is either we're going to solve it, we're going to make it go away, and it's not going to be a thing anymore, but we're just going to have some more modern architecture, a lot more technology, and some electric cars. Or it's perpetual apocalypse. But neither one of these futures is accurate, nor are they particularly helpful, nor are they particularly motivating. Number one says, don't worry, it'll be taken care of by technology. You don't really have to engage with it. And number two is just overwhelming and scary, and nobody wants that. But neither one is scientifically accurate. Number one, unfortunately, we are living with climate change today, and we will continue to live with a changing climate for some time, even in the best case scenarios. But number two is a ways off. It is totally avoidable, and it's probably not going to look like that. So we created Probable Futures to bring climate science to bear, to help people be able to use climate science so that they could explore the realistic science-based probable futures in between these two. We wanted to work towards this, living well in a changing climate. So that means living well with the amount of warming that we are already living with today, that we've done very little to prepare for, as well as the warming that is highly likely in the future, but then working to avoid the most extreme outcomes. And in order to be motivated to avoid those extreme outcomes, it can be really helpful to actually know what it is that we are trying to avoid. So this concept of stability versus instability can be really helpful from a big picture perspective of understanding why and how to incorporate climate change into your thinking. But when I first started working in this space, I had a lot of questions about what climate change would actually look like and feel like and what it would be like, especially in specific places around the world. So when I first got involved in the climate science community, as you heard in my introduction, I came from a background in the arts. I had actually built a career in museums. So I had built a career out of helping experts and academics translate their work in ways that made sense and told stories and were resonant for general audiences. And I wanted to help do the same thing in climate science. And when I first came into the space, I started to learn about it, and I was looking at graphics and seeing things like this, and like this, and like this. And this isn't to throw shade on this. This is really important information. It's really important science being done, but it doesn't necessarily send the message that it's intuitive, that you can understand it. It doesn't send the message that it's for me. And it also doesn't really send the message that it could be particularly practically useful. So that's why we created Probable Futures. And we knew that a lot of what we would do is make climate model data available in maps. So this is really the best way to understand what climate change will be like, what it will feel like, and how it may intersect with things that we care about. So we started making maps of climate variables, of temperature, drought, precipitation, wildfire danger, things that we thought intersected with things that people cared about in real life. So we're going to start with this. concept of wet bulb temperature. And wet bulb temperature, you may say to yourself, wait, I thought you told me this was going to be something that I cared about. But actually, all humans care about wet bulb temperature, because why it's important is because humans have a specific climate niche. So we are animals. Sometimes we tend to forget that with all of this sophisticated civilization around us, but we are warm-blooded mammals. Our bodies have to stay a particular temperature, 98 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And so our bodies need to stay that temperature. And if they get too warm, one of two things needs to be true. Either the air around us needs to be cool enough that we can offload heat. So this room is probably something like 70 degrees or something. It makes it easy for our bodies to offload heat. Or if we ramped up the temperature about 20 degrees in here, we'd all start to sweat. And that sweat is what pulls heat away from our bodies through evaporation. So those are the ways that we cool ourselves down. And so what's really important for human health is not just air temperature, but air temperature and humidity, this concept of wet bulb temperature. And wet bulb temperature was not something that we really had to pay that much attention to in a past climate, because we really didn't have very high wet bulb temperatures anywhere. But now we need to start thinking about it. It's something that we need to be aware of and plan for. And so let's learn a little bit about wet bulb temperature. So if you woke up in the morning and you saw that the forecast said that it was going to be 78 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius, you'd probably be pretty excited about the day. But then when you add 100% humidity to it, now all of a sudden the US National Weather Service tells you to exercise extreme caution. So that kicks it into being a temperature that you want to make sure that you don't have elderly people or small children outside, that sort of thing. And then if you raise the temperature, the air temperature, to 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit, now all of a sudden it falls into that danger category. But even if at 75% humidity and 30 degrees air temperature, it still falls into that extreme caution category. And then this trend continues until you get to temperatures that are not survivable for the human body. 35 degrees wet bulb is generally thought to be a temperature that without some sort of external cooling mechanism, humans can't survive that. Now, we're not going to look at that temperature, but we're going to look at a map here of 82 degrees, or sorry, it's so small here, 28 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. So that's 82 degrees Fahrenheit and 100% humidity corresponds with that extreme caution category. So we're going to look at a lot of maps today for the rest of this talk. All of Probable Futures maps are organized around warming scenarios. And the first one is a half a degree of warming. That represents the time period of 1971 to 2000. That's the first time period that climate model data is made available. So we kind of use that as a proxy for what the conditions were of a stable climate 10,000 years before that. So it makes sense to kind of think of this as these are the conditions around which we built our modern society. And then we'll go from there. So it's really helpful to go back and to look at those past conditions, the conditions of the stable climate, because we built things around it. So we need to understand where we started out, what we had planned for, and then how things are changing from there. So this half a degree of warming map, you see a lot of gray here, and gray on Probable Futures maps equals 0. But the places where you do see color, a lot of it is green. And if you look at the key here, green is 1 to 3 days. So what that means is that in those places, in a past climate, they would 1 to 3 days a year meet that wet bulb temperature. Then some of the other places are in the blue, which is up to 2 weeks, and only in a few places around the world, and really only one populous area do they experience those temperatures, or in a stable climate, did they experience those temperatures over a couple of weeks or over a month? So let's see how that changes when I go to 1 degree of warming. I'll just flip back and forth, and you can see how significantly that changes just within a half a degree of warming. So we see big changes in the southeastern US, in South America, Western Africa, Eastern Asia. And 1 degree of warming we passed in the 2010s. We'll talk about timing in a little bit. We're closest to 1.5 degrees of warming right now. So we can see pretty big changes across the tropics and in other places. And 2, 2.5, and 3 degrees of warming, this is a very different wet bulb temperature profile than what we're used to and then what we built civilization around. So the way that we think about these maps is that some of them are really helpful for planning purposes. We need to be prepared for certain temperatures and certain conditions in certain places around the world. But some of these are really just helpful to understand why we need to work so hard to mitigate our emissions and what those extreme scenarios look like. And it's a lot easier to get motivated for that when you understand what these futures might look like. Now that particular variable, wet bulb temperature and heat and humidity, is one that changes really dramatically over the course of warming. And there's a climate literacy concept that explains that. This is, I think, a super important climate literacy concept. It explains really a lot of the consequences that we see from a warmer atmosphere, which is that warmer air holds more moisture. So for every 1 degree warmer the air is, it can hold 7% more water vapor. And so what that means is that that warmer air draws more moisture from the land through evaporation. It can hold that moisture up there for longer because it has that greater carrying capacity, and that can create elongated dry periods below. And then when it does come down, it can come down in greater quantities than would be possible at lower temperatures. So what this means is that really a warmer world is really just going to have less mild weather, fewer showers, more deluges, more elongated dry periods. So it's not really one thing. And in a lot of places, both will happen. And that was the case leading up to the fires in LA. So we all, I'm sure, watched with the same amount of compassion when we saw the Palisades and other areas of LA burn last year. Leading up to those fires, there were a couple of years where it was unusually wet in LA. And so what happened in those years was that a lot of vegetation grew. And then when that vegetation dried out and a fire was ignited, there was just much more vegetation available for those Santa Ana winds. So that's how these differing patterns work together to create some of these bigger risks. So let's talk about drought. Drought, I think, is really interesting because it is because it's really an artifact. The term itself is an artifact of a stable climate. A drought, by definition, is something that's temporary, something that when you're talking about a drought, we're in a drought right now, but you expect it to go back to normal. That's what it was. And we could have a thing like drought in a stable climate. But that's not the case anymore. So that'll change as the atmosphere warms. So the map that we're looking at is the likelihood of 12 months or more where the conditions for extreme drought are met. The definition of extreme drought is a drought that in a stable climate happened about 5% of the time. So about a once in a generation event, once in 20-year event. Advancing to 1 degree of warming, the places in that pea green color now is more like a 1 in 10-year event, or maybe even closer to a 1 in 5-year event. At 1.5 degrees of warming, you see places show up in that yellow. That's more like a 1 in 3-year event. At 2 degrees, 2.5, and 3, we see a lot of places show up in that bright orange or that deep red color, both of which are over 50% of the time. So at that point, that's not really a drought anymore. That's more like aridification, and that's just more of a regular pattern. Of course, we see those deep color. I mean, first of all, we see widespread increased drought probability, but we see those red colors in places where there are a lot of people live, or places that are really historically important, or places that have really important global ecosystems, like or local ecosystems that are important globally, like the Amazon. So more often than not, actually most often, I'm speaking to a room of CEOs or board members or people that have a significant amount of power. And I show them these maps on purpose and ask them, do you think that your company is going to be thriving with the conditions of a 3-degree world? And the point is to help them understand what that may look like and to help motivate them to avoid these scenarios. Because it's not hard to imagine how agriculture might be disrupted, how the global economy might be disrupted. We know that drought is the best indicator of human migration. So we need to help people understand what these futures might look like in specifics, in detail. And I have seen this over and over and over again. People who are very smart, who are very educated, who have been around a long time, and they say to me, I swear to God, I didn't know. I didn't know that this was the kind of conditions that we were going to see. And I have seen people completely change their attitudes and their commitment around climate change because of how we actually communicate it to them and how we talk to them about risk. So let's just talk about the timing here. As I mentioned, 0.5 degree is around the 1980s, 1 degree we passed in the 2010s. There wasn't a big announcement at that time. We just kind of went past it. We're closest to 1.5 degrees now. And so we really need to be prepared to live with those conditions. 2 degrees, we're still very much on pace for 2 degrees. It's still a pretty highly likely that we reach 2 degrees of warming. However, with rapid decarbonization, we can stave it off longer, and staving it off longer is a good thing. It gives us and plants and animals more of a chance to adapt. But 2.5 and 3 are still very much choices. We absolutely have the opportunity to avoid those if we do what we need to now in terms of deploying clean energy, changing our food system, and lowering emissions. So let's start to look at some specific places now. We'll get away from the global story a little bit and talk more about specific places and talk more about how we can actually adapt to the conditions that we know that we're going to live with. And we're going to do so in the spirit of hope, because preparation, being prepared for these conditions, is a hopeful act. It is saying we are going to be here, we plan to be here, and we plan to thrive, and we're going to understand the risks and actually prepare for them rather than put blinders on. So let's talk about climate adaptation a little bit. To the extent that anyone ever really thinks about climate adaptation or has an imagination for it, I think they often think that it looks like this: a gigantic seawall, some engineering marvel around a really rich place that has the resources to do this sort of thing. But in reality, this is not actually what climate adaptation is going to look like. There may be some of this, but more of it will be different things in different places. So there is no one giant solution, but there are a myriad of potential strategies. And one that I like to talk about has to do with human behavior and just what we plan for and how we organize our communities. So this is a picture of roofs in Paris. In 2003, there was a big heat wave that came through Europe. France in particular was not very prepared for it. They've got zinc roofs all over the place. 5% of the population in France has air conditioning. It was built around a very mild climate, and it's a place with a lot of old architecture. And a lot of people ended up dying during that heat wave, about 15,000 people actually. So afterwards, the government got together and they said, okay, obviously it's going to happen more often. We need a plan. And the majority of what was in that plan was really, it boiled down to two things. One was an early warning system. So just getting the word out that these temperatures are coming, we need to be prepared for them. And the second thing was a massive communications campaign asking people to check on their neighbors. And the next time a similar heat wave came through France, almost no one died, just because of those two things. So there are lots of things that we can do that are low cost, that are pro-social, that make our communities stronger and better and more resilient. But these are things that we are going to have to solve for as individual communities, because adaptation is local. Adaptation depends on what the people in that place care about, what they want to preserve. And that is totally based on their values. And it's also based on how they are used to dealing with different kinds of environmental hazards. So this map that we're looking at is the change in annual precipitation in Mumbai. So of course, Mumbai is a place that gets a lot of precipitation. So if you had this amount of precipitation, so in a median year, something like 58 inches, that sounds like a huge amount of precipitation, a huge amount of water to us here in Boston, but that's typical in Mumbai. Now, depending on the warming scenario, we see those numbers go up. And the question is this a big deal in Mumbai? I mean, this is what we're looking at here is the change in total annual precipitation. There's also, we could be looking at the change in precipitation of the 1 in 100-year storm. So there are different ways that you can look at precipitation and think about it. But this is a place where they're very good at dealing with water, but they're still going to have to deal with more of it. So we need to have approaches and make changes, but it's not for Probable Futures or really anyone else to parachute into Mumbai and say, here's what climate change is going to mean for you. We need to make this information in this climate literacy widespread so that communities can understand the risks that they face, prioritize what they value, prioritize what they want to plan for, and be empowered to do so. Adaptation is also going to require systems thinking. So while it is very local, we live in a very interconnected, globalized world. And one way to look at that, to visualize that, I like to describe this by looking at frost nights in California. So frost nights is nights where it dips below freezing. And so this past warming scenario here is telling you, so I've clicked on a place in the mountains in the Sierra Nevadas, and I've done that because most of the water, the fresh water in California comes from the Sierra Nevadas. And in fact, half of America's fruits and vegetables are grown in the valleys below the Sierra Nevadas, and they are irrigated through snowmelt, through the rivers that come through there. And similarly, Los Angeles, their fresh water comes from the mountains in California. So how often it freezes up in those mountains is actually really important, because freezing temperatures is a way to store water. So I'll just go through these warming scenarios here. You'll see how this changes. You get how this works now. You can go on probablefutures.org. You can go anywhere, almost anywhere in the world, zoom into a local area. We have 30 different climate variables and explore. And the reason that there are so many climate variables, and the reason that you can go drill into a specific place is because different things are going to matter in that place, but we're interconnected. So the rest of the US needs to think about, what is happening environmentally in California and elsewhere. So we need to turn on our systems thinking. And then importantly, climate risk and addressing climate risk is not just about your exposure to a climate hazard. So that's a lot of what we've been looking at. These maps are exposure maps. So they, tell us if a certain place is likely to see certain temperatures or other variables. But it's not just about if you're exposed, it's also if you are prepared for those hazards. So the map that we're looking at here is change in wildfire days. Of course, we know that a lot of places out west are used to dealing with wildfires. Now those wildfires are becoming bigger, as we talked about, but there is already infrastructure there. There's even a culture around it where lots of people, who live in LA or California or Colorado maybe have a go bag on a regular basis. In Massachusetts, that's not something that we really think about or plan for or have any infrastructure around, but it is something that we are going to need to plan for in the future. So right now, our exposure to wildfire is low, but our vulnerability is actually somewhat high because we don't have a plan. We don't necessarily have infrastructure for it. So as I go through the warming scenarios here, you'll see on the eastern seaboard and in the Midwest how significantly that changes and how widespread it is. The reason that all of these colors, where a lot of it was gray before, but a lot of it has color now, is because at 3 degrees of warming and some, really just the plants are in the wrong place at that point. They're in the wrong climate. So the higher we go in terms of warming, really anywhere where there is vegetation, there will be some wildfire risk. That doesn't necessarily mean that will happen. Wildfire requires an ignition source, so it requires fuel and it requires ignition. So that doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to happen. If we manage things well, then we can avoid those issues. So winding down here, what we do is help people build their climate awareness, help them incorporate it into their thinking. Like I said, largely we focus on folks who are in positions of power right now because they're the ones with the responsibility to address this. And so we think that incorporating climate awareness, even if it's just thinking about climate risk, can make a real difference in terms of accepting the warming that we're living with and avoiding the worst scenarios. So what we tell the companies that we talk to and the organizations that we talk to, we say, you need to be asking yourself climate questions on a regular basis. It needs to be a business standard and a social norm to incorporate climate thinking into your day-to-day decision making. We need to be asking ourselves, what are our climate risks? What level of warming are we planning for? What is our risk tolerance and what is our vulnerability? Is our board, C-suite, and team climate literate? So everyone can have at least a basic amount of climate literacy. And have we factored climate futures into that big decision that we're making? But you can also do that at an individual level. Like I said, often we're talking with people and we'll ask them, do you plan to leave your house to your kids? Is your house in a coastal community? You should really be thinking about that. Not necessarily saying that you can't do that, but it should be part of your thinking. What am I planting in my garden? So am I planting something that is for the right climate? Do I know what the risks are in my community? And if I know, do others know? Do I have a role to play there? Am I committed to that community? This is actually a really important topic when it comes to climate adaptation, because we live in a world where we're very mobile, where I'm willing to guess that a lot of, just like me, a lot of people in this room are probably living here but grew up somewhere else, or maybe plan to live somewhere else. So are we going to be committed to place? And are we going to build community and make sure that we're prepared for the impacts in that place? Am I teaching my kids, or are we teaching our students how to live with resilience? You know, even things like knowing how to cook and enjoying life and dancing and having friends. Those are all resilient acts. I think, you know, we had a conversation with a friend of ours whose house burnt in the LA wildfires. And he said, the most resilient thing that I had at that moment was a friend where we could go stay with them. So again, you know, resilience is about so many things and can actually be pro-social. So just to reflect, I know that this is a lot. Believe me, it's a lot for me to talk about and think about every single day. But we have a really amazing, wonderful planet. It gives us so much. We do not need to abandon it. We don't need to go to Mars. Mars sucks, okay? It's not going to be great. Your body would be blown to bits through the cosmic energy, and there's no water, so there's also not an atmosphere. So the climate will not be as perfect as it was during that early civilization, but we still have a lot that we can save. And it is still, the other thing is that we understand it. I mean, you all are in learning about, you know, many of you I know are in the environmental studies program, but thank goodness that we understand our Earth system. It could be a gigantic mystery. It could be like AI, you know, where nobody actually knows what's going on, but we understand it. We understand how to avoid runaway climate change, and we have all of the tools to do it. That's actually pretty lucky. So we can live well in a changing climate if we think ahead, use our imaginations, and prepare. So thanks very much. I'm happy to keep chatting, happy to keep looking at maps. We can pull up different things or just have a conversation. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Alison, for an accessible and beautiful presentation. While people gather their thoughts, I actually have several questions, but I will just ask one to begin with. And it's maybe more a small one. I noticed all of your maps had the different scenarios based on degrees rather than time. So I was wondering, is that a way to battle uncertainty, or what is the intention behind that decision? Because I can imagine the people you're presenting this to don't necessarily know when those potential scenarios will likely happen, right?
Yeah.
So I was curious about that.
Well, two reasons. One is because of uncertainty. So if we had put times in there, that is assuming certain emissions trajectories. So if we had organized that around, you know, if we had organized it based on the trends that we're on now, then that 3-degree scenario would say something like 2070 or 2080. But we don't ever necessarily have to get to 3 degrees of warming. So part of it is just helping to have that risk thinking around this. We don't necessarily have to get to those scenarios. Those scenarios are probable futures. They are potential futures. Yeah, so there are a lot of assumptions that are being made when you frame it in terms of time. And so the science really works best if you organize it around the warming scenarios, because the atmosphere doesn't really care when you get to 2 degrees of warming, but these are the conditions of a 2-degree world, no matter if we get there or when we get there. So, and then we can also, you know, on the site and in the presentation, we talked a little bit about timing. But again, that timing is a choice in many cases.
I guess that segues into another thing I was thinking about, which is, you mentioned 2070, for example. So if you present those maps with that 2070 deadline, sort of, how does that compel the owner of a company to make decisions that are long-term versus potential missed short-term profits.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have created a whole bunch of systems in today's society that are organized around short-term thinking. So it is a real challenge. So that's why we have the closer warming scenarios, like the current scenario, because we've done very little to prepare for that. So we can have short-term and long-term conversations. So we can say, okay, we're basically at 1.5 degrees. Are you prepared for these particular conditions? In most cases, the answer is no. 2 degree, and the other thing that we do is help people understand the kinds of timeframes that they actually are working with. Like, it may be the case that, if you're a CEO, you're working on, quarterly investment reports, but you also probably have loans or mortgages or investments that are on a 30-year time frame. And so when you start to think about the different time horizons of decisions that we make, you do start to get into those higher warming scenarios. So our approach is, we start with that near-term stuff and just talk really practically. So for example, we were engaging with a agriculture company, and they had done a lot of work on sustainability. They were really proud of what they had done to reduce emissions, and they had thought almost nothing about the fact that they grow very specific, very delicate spices and plants in different places around the world. And they had thought very little about how the climate was changing in those places. So we talked about, near-term things and approaches to adaptation. But then at that point, once they're bought in, we can start to get into more long-term conversations. And one of the graphics that I will often use, that I didn't use here because it actually puts the timeline of the warming scenarios and puts the lifetime of a 10-year-old child on top of it. And so, I'm going into CEO offices, and by the end of the conversation saying, this is what you're committing a 10-year-old child to. Are you comfortable with that? And at that point, we've built up some credibility. We've had some conversation. They understand the science at this point. And so we've seen that be pretty effective. So we are able to get into the longer term conversations and the more profound conversations, but we have to start with baby steps.
Thank you.
Because, sorry to keep going, but at the end of the day, yes, these people are making decisions, based on a context of a company and quarterly earnings reports and that sort of thing, but they are still humans. And so we do go in there and plan to appeal to their humanity. We just start with the context of the thing that we're all there to talk about, this particular business, and then we get to the humanity stuff.
That's great. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. I have 2 questions. One, where do you guys get your data from? I'm sure that there's probably a couple different sources because there's just so many different things that you guys measure. And then my second is, how do you probability weight some of these extreme uncertainty events, like climate tipping points, or maybe ice sheet collapses, those kinds of things where we're really uncertain about what particular temperature would set that off, but obviously that kind of a thing would make a really big impact on the climate.
Yeah. So all of the data comes from global climate models. So it really does all come from one source. And then those global climate models are put through regional climate models. So if we have any climate model enthusiasts in here, as I am, this is Cordex Core data. So it's global climate models dynamically downscaled, put through the Cordex Core, or a couple of regional climate models that end up in the Cordex Core database. So none of it is probable futures data, and it all comes from the same place. It all comes from the same, data that the IPCC reports use. And so to your second question, the big picture uncertainties are, we can only deal with them the way that the climate models deal with them. So if they are incorporated into the climate models, then they would be incorporated into our data. We know that they're largely not incorporated into those climate models. So I'll say two things. I actually forgot to make a point of when I clicked on that cell there, there was the average year, the cooler year, and the warmer year. Those represent the 5th and the 95th percentiles of the climate model. So that's the way that we at least deal with what's on the extremes within the climate model. So here's, you know, what a cooler year might look like, and here's what the warmer year, the 95th percentile, might look like. But we can't go beyond that because climate models don't go beyond that. We are actually working on a project right now to do more communication around the tipping points, but they will largely not be, you know, map based in the way that these are, because we just don't have the data or the knowledge really to be able to show it in that kind of a precise way.
Got it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. That was really amazing. We have a question here from online attendee.
Okay.
She asks, a lot of what I hear you talking about is empowerment at the local level, but a lot of our overculture, including governments and corporations, focus on top-down solutions. How can we get CEOs and others with power to think about climate for business purposes, but also about how to work towards empowering ordinary people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the short answer is what we are doing is how we are approaching that, which is, well, two things. Number one, the reason that we made this in the way that we did, so Probable Futures is available to anyone in the world for free. It's available in 4 languages right now. We plan to do more in the future. And then we partner with different organizations who have their own communities and who can take the information and the learnings and incorporate it into their communities. So for example, we work closely with Mercy Corps, the humanitarian aid organization that works in something like 50 different countries. And Probable Futures in this climate literacy education is now incorporated into their training when they bring people on, so that people have this climate literacy, and that they can bring these tools into the countries and into the communities that they work with. So we created it so that everyone could access it and work through organizations that have much more access to those local communities than we do. We're a small organization. And then from there, then we go and deliver this message to the organizations like that person is talking about in the private sector. How can we get more interconnection between the two? You know, that's a bigger question than I can answer necessarily, but I think it does start with all having shared information about what these risks actually look like. Before Probable Futures existed, there was really no way to get this information except in kind of IPCC reports, but not at the local level, like the way, and we saw companies that were cropping up that were for-profit climate intelligence companies that were, you know, selling consulting services and their know-how of tapping into the climate models. They were selling it to communities for very high fees, $250,000 for a climate intelligence analysis. And we didn't think that made sense. So I think it really does start with shared information, shared truths, and open science. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. I was just wondering, so you talked about how you have presented this presentation to like C-suites and a lot of CEOs. How does your company come into contact with these organizations? Like, do you reach out to them or is it a partnership that you establish? And this is kind of extending on that. Have you ever run into issues where, for example, a CEO is kind of resistant to talking about climate change or the effects that this has on their company and the change that they could be making but are in at the moment?
Mhm. So on the first question, that has to do with basically our origin story, how we got started. So my counterpart, Spencer Glendon, he's the founder of Probable Futures. Today, he's actually presenting at HBS, and I'm here with you all. So we're dividing and conquering within the Boston academic community today. But he was the director of research at Wellington Management for 20 years and really built up a strong reputation in finance. I was working at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. So I, at the time, was trying to build bridges between climate science and other parts of society from the science side. He was trying to build bridges between climate science and other parts of society from the finance side. And we created a partnership between Wellington and the Woodwell Climate Research Center that was really the first of its kind, having investors actually pose questions of climate scientists and then saying, okay, well, let's see if we can, mine the climate models and see if we can answer those questions. Really, as a way to, as a proof of concept that climate science could actually be really useful for decision making. That turned into a couple of other now fairly well-known projects on between climate risk and capital markets. So it's been really kind of building up a reputation over time. We actually don't approach anyone. Basically, they just approach us. Like, we only ever get invited. And that was, we intended that. We kind of orchestrated so it would be like that. I mean, but I think one of the things is that, this is about just basic climate literacy, and it's about physical risk. We don't get into talking a ton about clean energy or about politics or about the things that really set people off when it comes to climate conversations. So, and this actually gets to your second question about, do we get pushback? We don't get a lot of pushback because it's really the conversation is about the weather. That's it. And how the weather is changing, how those changes intersect with the thing that you care about or that you're responsible for, and what we're going to do about it. And so it avoids a lot of the pitfalls of climate communications, and avoids conversations about shame. So about, like that truck that you're driving or, that steak that you ate or whatever. It's really just like, let's just get started talking about the weather. And it makes people much more open to the conversation. Eventually, the conversation does always get to mitigation and clean energy, and because that's the only place that you can really end up if you do take the science seriously. And I would also say that we don't get a lot of pushback also because most people that are in those positions of responsibility, like, really take that responsibility seriously. And so, we'll often hear things like, oh my God, like, that's what the drought projections in Spain look like. Like, we have 40,000 people who work in Spain. We're responsible for those people. So we find, like, we don't do a lot of presentations with, like, it's not actually just because they're in charge that we do the presentations with the C-suites and the board. It's that the people with the most responsibility are actually the most open-minded to hearing this, because they, risk sits with them. And really, it does all come down to this, like, framing it all around risk, which, from at least the corporate system that we've set up with, they have a fiduciary duty to understand and address that risk. They don't necessarily have a fiduciary duty to deploy clean energy, but they do have to manage risk. And so this is a way into that conversation that is consistent with what they're responsible for.